Hi, my name is Claire Winkler, for those of you who don't already know that, though I would hope that at this point in the semester, most of you know that I'm Claire. Anyway, this is my oral interpretation. I will be doing a selection from The Country of the Pointed Birds by Sarah Ann Jewett. It comes from chapter 6, which is called The Waiting Place, and I will be orally interpreting the section where Captain Littlepage tells the narrator what Gaffett told him about the waiting place. It begins on page 21, the very, very top, and I will just go ahead and start, and if you want to follow along, feel free. And here we go. There's a strange sort of country way up north beyond the ice, and strange folks living in it. Gaffett believed it was the next world to this. "What do you mean, Captain Littlepage?" I exclaimed. The old man was bending forward and whispering. He looked over his shoulder before he spoke the last sentence. "To hear old Gaffett tell about it was something awful," he said, going on with the story quite steadily after the moment of excitement had passed. "'Twas first a tale of dogs and sledges, and cold and wind and snow. Then they begun to find the ice grow rotten. They had been frozen in and got into a current flowing north, far up beyond Fox Channel. And they took to their boats when the ship got crushed, and this warm current took them out of sight of the ice and into a great open sea. And they still followed it due north, just the very way they had planned to go. Then they struck a coast that wasn't laid down or charted, but the cliffs were such that no boat could land until they found a bay and struck across under sail to the other side where the shore looked lower. They were scant of provisions and out of water, but they got a sight of something that looked like a great town. 'For God's sake, Gaffett,' said I the first time he told me, 'you don't mean a town 2 degrees farther north than the ships have ever been?' For he'd got their course marked on an old chart that he'd pieced out at the top, but he insisted upon it and told it over and over again to be sure I had it straight to carry to those who would be interested. There was no snow and ice, he said, after they had sailed some days with that warm current, which seemed to come right from under the ice that they'd been pinched up in and had been crossing on foot for weeks. 'But what about the town?' I asked. 'Did they get into the town?' 'They did,' said the captain, 'and found inhabitants. 'Twas an awful condition of things. It appeared, as near as Gaffett could express it, like a place where there was neither living nor dead. They could see the place when they were approaching it by sea pretty near like any town, and thick with habitations. But all at once they lost sight of it altogether, and when they got close inshore they could see the shapes of folks, but they never could get near them, all glowing gray figures that would pass along alone, or sometimes gathered in companies as if they were watching. The men were frightened at first, but the shapes never came near them. It was as if they blew back, and at last they all got bold and went ashore, and found birds' eggs and seafowl, like any other wild northern spot where creatures were tame and folks had never been and there was good water. Gaffett said that he and another man came near one of the fog-shaped men that was going along slow with the look of a pack on his back among the rocks, and they chased him. But Lord, he flittered away out of sight like a leaf the wind takes with it, or a piece of cobweb. They would make as if they had talked together, but there was no sound of voices, and they acted as if they didn't see us, but only felt us coming towards them," said Gaffett one day, trying to tell the particulars. "They couldn't see the town when they went ashore. One day the captain and the doctor were gone till night up across the high land where the town had seemed to be, and they came back at night beat out and white as ashes, and wrote all next day in their notebooks, and whispered together full of excitement, and they were sharp-spoken with the men when they offered to ask any questions. There came a day," said Captain Littlepage, leaning toward me with a strange look in his eyes and whispering quickly. "The men all swore they wouldn't stay any longer. The man on watch early in the morning gave the alarm, and they all put off in the boat and got a little way out to sea. those folks, or whatever they were, come about him like bats. All at once they raised incessant armies, and come as if to drive him back to sea. They stood thick at the edge of the water like the ridges of grim war, no thought of flight, none of retreat. Sometimes a standing fight, then soaring on main wing, tormented all the air. And when they got the boat out of reach of danger, Gaffett said they looked back, and there was the town again, standing up just as they had seen it first, coming on the coast. Say what you might, they all believed 'twas a kind of waiting place between this world and the next. The captain had sprung to his feet in his excitement, and made excited gestures, but he still whispered huskily. "Sit down, sir," I said as quietly as I could, and he sank into his chair quite spent. Gaffett thought the officers were hurrying home to report and fit out a new expedition when they were all lost. At the time, the men got orders not to talk about what they had seen, the old man explained presently in a more natural tone. "Weren't they all starving, and was it a mirage or something of that sort?" I ventured to ask. But he looked at me blankly. Gaffett had got so that his mind ran on nothing else, he went on. The ship's surgeon let fall an opinion to the captain one day. That was some condition of the light and the magnetic currents that let them see those folks. 'Twasn't a right feeling part of the world, anyway. They had to battle with the compass to make it serve, and everything seemed to go wrong. Gaffett had it worked out on his own mind that they were all common ghosts, but the conditions were unusually favorable for seeing them. All right, so there are several reasons why I picked this passage to interpret and subsequently analyze. The most basic reasons, I thought it was by far the most interesting part of the book. I did enjoy the country of the pointed firs. However, it is a lot of just narrative and description of people and the town, and it paints a really beautiful picture of life in Dunnet Landing, which I definitely appreciated and I enjoyed reading. It almost reminded me of Anne of Green Gables in parts, actually, which is kind of strange. I'm not really sure why I made that association, but that's for another day. But it was the most action-packed part of the book, which isn't saying much because it's not particularly filled with action. Nevertheless, it definitely, I think it's because it was so different in tone from the rest of the book that it caught my attention. It had very eerie undertones. I am a big fan of ghost stories, and this was definitely a ghost story of sorts, which I definitely appreciated. It almost reminded me, actually it didn't almost remind me, it really did remind me of a Greek or Roman myth. I don't have one in mind in particular. I would have to Google and brush up on my Greek and Roman mythology to figure out exactly why it reminded me of one, and I was almost wondering if Sarah Ann Jewett maybe did that on purpose, but I have not yet researched that, so I can't say for sure. Initially, this passage reminded me, his Little Page's description of the waiting place reminded me of purgatory, and that's probably because I was raised Catholic and I went to Catholic school, so I have a tendency to look at anything as Catholic related, because even if you're a recovering Catholic, you're Catholic for life. But anyway, I don't think that is entirely off base though, because purgatory in the Catholic tradition is where you go to wait and atone for your sins before you get the privilege of going to heaven. But after closer analysis of the passage, I came to decide that purgatory isn't the most accurate comparison to make when looking at this selection, because purgatory is just, it's a temporary place. Once you're done atoning for your sins, you go to heaven and that's where you stay. The waiting place, I feel it's more of somewhere to which people return. And the reason why I think that is because I think it's very representational of Dunnet Landing. And as we've discussed in class, Dunnet Landing, it's the center of everything, and no matter what happens, no matter what the characters do or where they go, they always return home to Dunnet Landing. And that's kind of the picture that The Waiting Place painted in my head. What else? I think it's significant that it's Littlepage who told the narrator the story. I also think he's the only character who could have conceivably told the narrator the story as well. That's for obvious reasons, first of all, one of them being that other than Captain Tilly, he's the only former sea captain character in the book, which means that he's the only person who would have had the chance to meet other sailors and tell stories such as this one and bring stories such as this one back to Dunnet Landing. But I think there are deeper reasons beyond that one, that it's only Littlepage who could have told this story. We know very just broad, basic things about Littlepage that Jewett more or less outrightly tells us. We know that he is a former sea captain, that he is well-read. He's fairly strange. The townspeople have all known him for a very long time, but in spite of that, they don't really know what to make out of him. The only person he ever spends any real time with is his housekeeper, Mary Harris. But I think Jewett uses the Waiting Place story to reveal deeper and more important characteristics of Littlepage besides these ones. I mentioned that I think the Waiting Place is representational of Dunnet Landing because it's a place to which you can always return, and that's what Dunnet Landing is to the people of Dunnet Landing. I also think it's Jewett's way of warning against the dangers of isolation. The Waiting Place is very isolated from the rest of the world. Littlepage tells the narrator that Gaffett told him it was 2 degrees farther north than they'd ever been before. I believe it was probably the North Pole. I think even Jewett hints at that. Nevertheless, no one really lived there other than the strange ghosts. No one had ever been there before. No one had ever discovered it. No one knew about it. It was isolated. And Littlepage isolates himself as well. He doesn't really, like I said, he doesn't really interact or socialize with people. And the Waiting Place is a very sad, lonely, dark, eerie sort of place. And Littlepage's existence is sort of sad and lonely. He doesn't really seem to have many people in his life. He's different from the other people of Dunnet Landing because they are, always socializing and doing things together, and he sort of keeps to himself. And I think the Waiting Place was Jewett's way of sort of casting aside the idea of rugged male individualism and embracing the idea of socializing and being with your friends, the things more commonly attributed to women and occasionally looked down on. So, in conclusion, I think the Waiting Place is the most interesting part of the Country of the Pointed Firs. I definitely think it's rich with things to analyze, and there's definitely a lot more things to look at than what I just chose to address in this oral interpretation and analysis. I really enjoyed looking at this passage, and I especially enjoyed getting to know the character of Littlepage better because I think he's a very complex and definitely unique individual. I hope that this video was enlightening, and I hope I wasn't too awkward. because making a video in your room at night is definitely a strange experience. But I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of yours.